I'm Deborah Lair, Executive Director of the Paulson Institute and the CEO of Edelman Global Advisory. Thank you all for joining what promises to be an informative and stimulating discussion. And a special thanks to Ambassador Yasser El-Nagar for facilitating this event today. So we're 10 days away from the biggest climate conference of the year, the UN COP27. This conference will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt and will host government leaders, NGOs, activists, and private industry from all around the world. It will be the site of intense negotiations and hopefully some important breakthroughs. So what should we expect out of COP27? What are the major outcomes that governments are driving toward, and how will they get there? And what perspectives does Egypt bring to the table as the president of this year's COP? I'm so pleased to introduce today's distinguished speakers who will help to shed light on these and many other questions. First, let me introduce Hank Paulson, my longtime boss and mentor, who served as the 74th Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and was CEO and Chairman of Goldman Sachs. Today, he's the Chairman of the Paulson Institute, as well as Executive Chairman of the $7 billion TPG Rise Climate Fund. Hank and his wife, Wendy, are dedicated and active supporters of seeking solutions to the combined threats of climate change and biodiversity. Secretary Paulson will be in conversation with Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. Dr. Mohieldin is an economist with more than 30 years of experience in international finance and development. We're fortunate that he agreed to serve as the UN climate change high-level champion for Egypt, given his deep experience in economics, finance, and sustainability. Hank, over to you.
Okay, well, Deborah, thank you very much. And Mahmoud, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Before diving in, let's start with your role as a UN climate change high-level champion. What's your job description? Tell us a bit about the role and how it fits into the broader task ahead for this year's UN climate conference, the COP27.
Very good. Thank you so much, Hank. Many thanks to the kind introduction, Deborah. Well, let me describe what the climate champions with this impressive title should do. We have a mandate that came from Marrakesh summit just 1 year after the successful conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 2015. There was a growing realization of the importance of the non-state actors, including business sector, financial institutions, subnational entities, NGOs, think tanks. So everybody who's not negotiating as part of delegations are being coordinated by the champions team. And we have really a role to follow up on the pledges to keep the momentum going. And we push further in that. So my role is to do that kind of function for COP27, which will be hosted in Egypt in 10 days, which marked the start, not the end of the Egyptian presidency of the climate discussions and process. And I'm number 7 in this role. And at any time, there are always 2 champions and 1 team. So I'm now working closely with Nigel Topping from the Glasgow summit. And in a few days, there will be a new partner, a new champion from the UAE, which is going to be the host for COP28.
So, Mahmoud, you've been very, very busy since 2015, but let's set the stage and go back to 2015 when the landmark Paris Agreement was signed. In terms of climate action, how far has the world come since Paris? And how much farther do we need to go? I know that's a big question, but it's an important one.
Indeed. I think on substance, there is growing awareness of the importance of climate action, supported by science and evidence, but actually with what we see almost every day and every week and every month of sad events that have been confronting many countries, advanced or developing countries, including more recently what we saw in Pakistan having 1/3 of its land underwater. The more severe weather events, cyclones, fires in forests, deterioration in the quality of the environment around the world impacted by the climate agenda. The IPCC report, which is the scientific report coming from the UN system, is realizing that there is some interesting developments, including the role of the private sector in mitigation, including decarbonization, investing in renewable energy. And when whatever partnership happens between public and private sector, this would have a good impact on the economy and society. But we're not doing a good job in the pace that is required, and we're not on track to achieve the goals and targets of the Paris Agreement, including keeping the 1.5 degrees alive. When we see that the trajectory from now until 2030, that we need to reduce emissions by 45%, actually we're doing the opposite. We're adding 14 to 15% a year. So we're deviating from target by something like 60%. The thing that we need to do fast now is to do what we can to bring that kind of momentum again into track. I know it's difficult, especially after the war in Ukraine, which pushed the prices of energy high and denied access as well to some essential supplies, including in Europe. But I would say that could be part of our discussion on how to deal with this crisis in the short term and midterm. But mitigation needs to be kept on track. Adaptation needs to be taken more seriously because it was not really given sufficient attention. And I always refer to finance rather than the nice words and promises. If finance is there and you have been leading financial innovation and big financial institutions and public and the private side, and I take finance not just as funding, but basically as a good signal of seriousness. And then we have a lost file, which is loss and damage. So these are basically the three tracks, just to make matters simple. What we're doing in mitigation, we're doing something, but not with the pace that we wish. What we're doing adaptation, definitely we need to do more. Loss and damage, we need to get our act together in it.
Mahmoud, that's an excellent summary. I always say when I get asked about these big conferences in Paris, I always make the point that they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. There's a lot of work that has to be done to help us realize these voluntary targets. And we're not on track, right? And even if we were on track to meet the targets, the world is still going to overheat. So as you said very well, we need to work hard on mitigation to prevent the very worst outcomes. But the point you made, what I really want to emphasize, is adaptation and resilience. Because no matter what we do, the world is going to overheat and we're going to have these climate weather shocks, and they're going to hit some parts of the world much harder than others. And so that has to be a big part. And the thing that I like about your job is that I don't think governments are giving the private sector and the Bretton Woods institutions and the multilateral development banks the tools they need, right? And so we need to get all sorts of others as being part of the solution, and that's a big part of your job. So let's now go to COP27, which will be held next month in Egypt. And as you said, there's no shortage of issues on the agenda. So let's go through a few of them. This year, as we've seen many nations, and you alluded to this, add new fossil fuel infrastructure that will be around for the long term to overcome short-term energy shortages. Now, how can COP27 succeed under these circumstances? And how can the world go green in the midst of an energy crisis? Now, I realize those are big challenges, and every bit of progress helps. So talk a bit about those issues.
Right. Just to be realistic about what's happening, well, there is some sort of, I would say, extreme pragmatism and flexibility when it comes to utilization of different sources of energy. Countries under pressure, they just burn what they have in order to get energy for society, for manufacturing, for production, for transport. So I would say that there are two waves. In the short wave, there is this kind of reliance on fossil fuel. But at the same time, which we are realizing now in the markets by huge investments in renewable energy, solar, wind, green hydrogen, there is no week passed during the last 6 months unless we get in the news some MOU being signed with a consortium in Africa, supported by variety of financial institutions and leading businesses to produce energy from green hydrogen. So I'm seeing here the renewables, alternative energy, including green, solar, wind, and the return to nuclear, are becoming now the midterm to long-term kind of investments that's starting now by mobilizing the funds. There are some good efforts as well in decarbonization. I know that there is a very big, ambitious program led by G7, the JETP, or the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which started with South Africa. It has India, Vietnam, and other countries in consideration. These countries rely more on coal. But I would suggest, great that we do that, but at the same time, let's do something in sectors that are ready to decarbonize, like cement, steel, shipment. And here, I'm happy that the name of Ambassador Yasser Nagar was mentioned, because in another hat and a capacity, he's leading some work here in Egypt to support the work in decarbonization of the cement industry. The beauty of this, that nobody's pushing the industry to do what it cannot, but they are pushing themselves in a good race towards decarbonization, supported, of course, by the government regulatory agencies and the general public. So I'm seeing some good movement there in the mitigation front and decarbonization. Less so on the adaptation. Adaptation, if we get it by figures, 98% of funding for adaptation is coming from public finance entities, either by the budgets of the states or through borrowing abroad or domestically to support the adaptation work. Only 2 to 3% is contribution from the private sector. The business case is not yet clear to the commercial participants in the market, as it is in, unlike what it is in the mitigation front. So we need to do more in this front.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, and I'd like to pick up on your point about investing in what I call greening industrials. You know, the cement, the steel, plastics, petrochemicals, work that's got to be done. And one of the things I'm encouraged about is the Biden administration climate bill is providing a lot of subsidies there to begin to make some of these technologies commercially viable. I think governments need to continue to do more. But I want to come back to your point on resilience and adaptation, because I do agree that the private sector needs to do more. Of course they do, but I think the government needs to do more to put in place the regulations, policies, practices, so that we really, the kinds of investments we're making are made to protect humanity, protect our economic security from these climate shocks that are sure to happen. Now, following from that, because one thing we all understand that is so insidious about climate change, it hits different geographies, different parts of the world, different industries harder than others, right? And so there's no doubt some of the countries that are least able to afford it are the ones that are going to be hit hardest by these weather shocks. And so another big issue on the agenda is what is known as loss and damage, or the question of how poor nations should be compensated for the impacts of climate change. Now, talk a bit about how you think about these issues and what policies and actions can be taken to assist developing economies adapt to a hotter planet. And here, I see this as particularly difficult because you look at most major wealthy nations, we're getting them to do more to deal with climate, but it's very hard politically, okay, for them to allocate money to other parts of the world. So talk about this very important issue.
Right. Yeah, indeed. A very important issue. But I think before we get into the controversial topic of the loss and damage, let me just get from your words now what could really complete that, what I call the golden triangle, to get matters into action when it comes to climate. We talk a bit about finance, and then you mentioned technology. This is really key. Without technology, we wouldn't have been able today to talk about green hydrogen projects or the race, which is a positive one between countries, including developing economies. Do you know where are the biggest 4 solar plants in the world? India, China, and Egypt. This number 4, and Morocco is investing fast in order to catch up, and Senegal has its own plans as well. So this is a very good race facilitated by finance and the advancement in technology. Technology may have been developed in the US or Europe, but the scale came from China. And you yourself know a lot about what China can really contribute when it comes to scale. Then there is the third part that you mentioned very quickly. It's the issue of regulations, because the regulations here is about changing behavior. And we can, of course, leave it to the market dynamics, the convictions of leaders in the market. But I think regulations would really standardize matters and get us all in the same playing field. These 3 issues, I was happy to have a conversation with Professor Duflo, the economist who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, on her work on development and poverty. And the talk was basically about climate. It was basically about the 3 things: finance, technology, including R&D, and of course, change behavior in all ways, including regulations. Now we get into this super controversial topic, which is loss and damage. And actually, it is in the Paris Agreement, but with lots of provisions and caveats on that are complicating the operationalization of the provisions in the Paris Agreement related to loss and damage. The discussions have been there years and years before Paris in 2015, especially by small states and small islands. But now we're being reminded strongly again by the same communities from the small islands, but more recently as well from Pakistan. Some figures available are telling us that we didn't do well in mitigation and we didn't do well in adaptation. Loss and damage is beyond both files. In whatever we can do today in mitigation, that would be great. But we need to invest in resilience and in adaptation. And that requires more than the 20% to 15% of contributions and finance coming from the MDBs. But this is another discussion. Then we get into loss and damage. It's beyond mitigation and adaptation. That cannot really be solved by adaptation. I know that some countries are trying to put the climate related matters of loss and damage under adaptation, but this is a completely different argument. It's more about compensation, and there is a stock and flow that we need to deal with. The flow could be helped through contributions from my community and the non-state actors, by having the insurance sector working, by some of the good work on early warning systems, by some good work by consultancies to help in the resilience of companies and the household sector. But the stock of problem that we had, which is contributing to the severe disasters that countries are suffering from, has something to do with loss and damage. The case of Pakistan, they say, well, around $30 billion of damage are required to be mobilized. We have seen the appeals from the Secretary General of the UN. They say half of the money is required, is related to loss and damage. The other half is basically about the year-to-year kind of variability of weather, or because of some practices at the domestic level. But half of the money should come really from outside the country, because they cannot really afford mobilizing such funds with the budget constraints. So far, less than 1% of the money required have been pledged or promised. So this is a very big issue. To solve it, and to be just, again, very realistic and pragmatic, the non-state actors cannot go beyond what the state actors are designing and framing. So the presidency of the COP, Minister Sameh Shukri, the president of the COP, asked Germany and Chile to work together to push towards a kind of convergence of ideas and practical solutions supported by funds, because what we have so far is some sort of semi-academic considerations and a mechanism here, a portal there, but this issue needs funding and scientific support.
It sure does, and I emphasize the scientific support and capacity building, because just pouring money in and not building it back better is not going to do a lot of good. So capacity building, really understanding what needs to be done in terms of building resilience into the system makes a big difference. Now, I don't want to keep beating on this drum too long, but just one additional question around this area. Last year in Glasgow, rich nations reaffirmed the importance of supporting the climate efforts of developing countries, but have so far, failed to meet that $100 billion target in financing, the $100 billion a year target. Are you optimistic that a COP27 countries can agree to mechanisms that will ensure that the funds find their way to countries that need them most? And that's a huge question. And how can you say you're optimistic about it, right? But again, to say that you've emphasized finance and you've emphasized technology and things that are done. So anything more on that comment, on that question?
Right. I know that there is a report that's going to be produced to update us on what happened since Glasgow, and that was going to be available before the COP. In Glasgow, they said, well, it's around 79% or more that had been achieved of the 100 billion. This came from the official report on tracing the contributions. The metric of measurement is being challenged because the assumption back in Copenhagen that the 100 billion is going to be public finance, mainly concessional support. But now the kind of metric is being challenged by the likes of NGOs like Oxfam, saying, well, the 80% that's being claimed, it could be much less than 20%. Anyways, let's assume that it is 80% for argument's sake. And we need to be fair as well, because not all countries are doing as good or as bad as the others. So we have 6 countries of the 26 that are required to contribute to the 100 billion are doing a fantastic job. More than 100% of their fair share and fair contributions have been delivered on annual basis. Mainly, I think the countries are Germany, France, Holland, and 3 Nordic countries. And we can really add Japan as well into that list. So, but the rest are doing much less than their fair share, and that needs really to be revised. Before we talk about the future of finance post 2025, we need to make sure that the old promise is being delivered. But the issue here, Hank, even if all countries submitting the 100 billion and delivering on their old promise, it is no more than 3% of the requirements for funding climate action and just transition. The International Energy Agency in Paris had been sharing figures that I would say, let me get the most conservative of them, is like $2.3 trillion a year for supporting climate action and just transition, only that part. So 100 billion is no more than 3% of the requirements. So here, we need to take the 100 billion, support multilateral development banks, the likes of the World Bank, region development banks, and others, help in de-risking, help in leveraging the private sector, and trying to tackle as well the frontier markets and the countries with higher risk than others, and then unleash the potential of the private sector, especially in mitigation. And I'm afraid we'll continue to rely on public sources for quite some time when it comes to adaptation.
Yeah, we've got our work cut out for us there. I would like to now, so let's talk about Egypt a bit. So tell us about the significance of the COP27 being held in Egypt. Why is the conference important for Egypt and the rest of Africa? What perspective does Egypt bring to the COP27 presidency that has been missing at previous conferences?
Well, this is an excellent question, and I tried to answer this question practically from day one, where on my non-state actors coordination role, by focusing on matters that are going to be really transformational, that they will resonate well in the country and society after the summit in Sharm. And yes, I can promise you, and I know that Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh are going to be great hosts for the summit. The preparation, the venues, the site, the UN rules of everything have been really prepared well on that front. The substance is, as reflected in the portal, is very encouraging to see that despite the crises that we have been facing before COVID, after COVID, before Ukraine war, and after, the substance is getting richer and deeper with very practical consideration, focusing on implementation. But I would like to pick really three things that I'm very proud of, that they are going to be with us for quite some time. First is the work on regional dimensions of the work. In preparation of the COP, we're super busy building pipeline of projects from Africa, from Latin America, ECLAC, this is the Latin America and the Caribbean region of the UN system, ESCAP, this is Asia, and then we went to Middle East and Arab countries, and then to emerging markets in Europe, to build a pipeline of investable, not just bankable, investable projects that could encourage the GFANZ members and other financial institutions that are not part of the GFANZ to consider these examples of projects in energy, in decarbonization and adaptation, the whole list. And we are going to be sharing this pipeline of projects, and it has been supported by good consultancy work, and we see some investment banks very much interested in this list. And we are going to share 50 examples just as illustrative examples in Sharm el-Sheikh. This is emphasizing the partnership and the investments and answering that old question about pipeline of projects. The second initiative that I'm very proud of is the localization of climate action. And we are taking Egypt to lead by example. It's not just about big summits to have leaders and top CEOs and society leaders coming, but it's basically about the impact in neighborhoods. And I think you have a prize on the Paulson Institute's name for best projects. I think you are focusing on China in this one. I checked it, about prizes to be given to environment and development interlinkages as demonstrated in some of the good examples of projects in China. We're doing something like that, but on a very big scale in Egypt. 27 governors are competing in 6 categories of projects to prove that they are smart and green. This is meaning climate action principles with digital transformation. And the final thing I like to share is basically mobilizing the think tanks, research centers, universities linked with business sector solutions and partnerships. And we have an academic community that is very eager to play a role. And actually, on a daily basis now, I'm spending at least an hour or two with one of the leading universities here in Egypt or the region And the region for Egypt is different from other countries. We are a proud African country, and we with Mediterranean links in our geography, and we're an Arab country at the same time. So we're using all of these regional dimensions to extend the network of the academics and scientists to support the work of the financiers and the investors.
I tell you, Mahmoud, that's very impressive. And it's impressive when you look at the backdrop you're doing it against with some of the economic and challenges that we have, that you have in Egypt, that we have globally with inflation, challenges around currency, and so on, that despite that, you've mobilized so much of the country. And I want to now talk about one of the other challenges you have, which is a high quality challenge. It's the kind of problem that you like to have, but it's difficult none the same. As COP president, how will Egypt balance some of the many competing voices that want a seat at the table? So it's great that so many people care about climate change, but from the South climate activists to energy companies who need to make the transition to net zero, how are you? I imagine how you working to fit all of these in is got to be a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, I was in discussion with the president of the COP, Ambassador Sameh Shukri, and his two lieutenants working hard with him, Ambassador Wael Abul Magd and Ambassador Muhammad Nasr. I think as a host, we're not really part of the competition on the negotiations and taking positions. Here, we're trying to give a space for every participant to demonstrate what they are after, putting the kind of argument as we are trying to do in one of the most controversial topics that we just discussed, the loss and damage. At the same time, each country coming with a strong delegation. Think here, we exhausted what we should be negotiating on in terms of texts. And Glasgow had been proven that we exhausted all of the possibilities of negotiation. We have a Paris Agreement. Now we have guidelines that which were produced in Glasgow, like operational manual. Now it's the stage of implementation that we need to be focusing on, with the exception perhaps on the loss and damage, because we don't really have sufficient operational mandate to do more as non-state actors or in partnership with the state actors. But it's all now about implementing what had been promised. But we need to put it in a different context, because I think, and I hope that you bear with me on that. In the past, I think there was a kind of a misleading reductionist approach to climate agenda to mean only decarbonization and putting a price tag to carbon. This is still very important. And actually, one of the initiatives led by Egypt is to establish a carbon market for developing economies based on integrity and capturing the value. But the climate agenda, as based on Paris Agreement, is much more comprehensive than that. We spoke about adaptation, we spoke about loss and damage, and we spoke about finance. And there are other elements as well. And we shouldn't be forgetting that the whole climate action is one of the sustainable development goals of the UN system. It's sustainable development goal number 13, climate action. What about poverty? What about development? What about job opportunities? How to deal with the impact of the current crises and say people, well, we're only focusing on the end of the century kind of targets for global warming, but we're not paying attention to access to energy or to food security. So when we're talking about implementation, we're doing that within a holistic framework, which I think is getting a great deal of traction by almost everybody we talk to. As much as we can really put climate action as part of the engine of transformation and sustainable development. And again, it gets me back to your prize on development and environment. There is no trade-off between trade, between development, between investment, getting them all seriously. This shouldn't be really at the expense of taking care of the environment and the climate action agenda. So this is going to be very different, and positively so, when we're talking about implementation in COP27.
I tell you, it's very energizing for me to hear the amount of thought you've put into this and the people you're bringing together here. Now, this is an area, the next question I'm going to ask is one that I think is, all of these are important, but this is one I focus on a lot. You've held a variety of senior roles at the World Bank and the IMF. How are these and other international finance institutions, all the multilateral development banks, adapting their work to better deal with the climate challenge? What role should these institutions play going forward?
Right. Well, thank you so much for this important question. I worked for almost 10 years at the World Bank, and I'm happy to see the progress in getting climate action seriously on the agenda. There is a strategy that's being updated. They have, I think, a target of 35% of the portfolio of the World Bank Group to be dedicated to climate action. I think last year they achieved 36%, not just 35, which is fine. They need definitely to do more. And there is some work as well in knowledge and technical cooperation and capacity development. The beauty of the likes of the World Bank or the Regional Development Bank, banks around us like the African one or the IDB, they don't just provide money, they provide money, technical assistance, and they share knowledge. And recently they have some good assessments of the climate action and the climate work, and they started to publish these reports. I think Egypt is going to be publishing its assessment on the climate developments, which is going to be very helpful to policymakers and the investors. But the IMF has been away from this agenda for quite some time. Under the leadership of Kristalina, the managing director of the IMF, two things have been happening. One, a new strategy for climate had been approved and supported with good implications on Article 4, which is basically the annual revision of the soundness of the economic systems, monetary, fiscal, and the overall economic performance of countries. So part of the assessment is going to be including now aspects related to the climate agenda. And a new fund called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund had been announced. It's now in existence since April this year. And actually it's in operations. And I'm happy to see that one of the first countries to benefit from this new fund is Barbados, which had been doing a lot under the leadership of Prime Minister Maya Motley in different aspects related to inclusive growth, sustainable development, and climate action. So they are going to be accessing this fund. But we need definitely to do more. And then there is one more thing, which I think I've been quoted more than once as saying that the climate finance agenda suffers from the fact that it is insufficient because we need more fund than what we have. It's inefficient because sometimes it takes 2 to 3 years from the day that you shake your hands with the partner from development institutions or specialized funds to the day that you get the money into projects, which is really too long. And then it's unfair because the price, especially with foreign exchange variability or sometimes instability, we need to have something more stable than that in funding. And I can really argue that an IDA-like kind of funding, the International Development Association terms, which are very concessional, could be extended not just to low-income countries, but to low-middle-income countries. That would be great to have.
Mahmoud, I could not agree with you anymore. You know, we're facing an existential crisis that is going to change in many ways the way we live, the way we work, threatens humanity. And the world is underinvesting in this. So governments get together at these UN conferences, they set targets, but they don't begin to provide the resources that are needed to meet the challenge. And so taking a look at the global financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, the multilateral development banks. There's no doubt your point on capacity building is key. Just giving money, of course, it helps, but it is not close to sufficient, because that money needs to be well spent to make a big difference. And the thing that I emphasize is, although we would like to see these institutions doing more, and they all can do more, this again comes back to the major countries that are the shareholders, right? Because what needs to be done is the shareholders need to change the charter. And they need to give these institutions the resources and the charter and the responsibility and the authority to really beef up what they're doing in terms of capacity building, to get the money out the door quicker, okay? And all those things. So I think we can all push on them around the edges, but until the major nations come together and the shareholders and change the charters in meaningful ways, I think we're still going to be short, right? And so I don't mean to put out an air of hopelessness, but I just do believe that a lot needs to be done there.
Yeah.
But I want to move to a different one, because I've spent a lot of time working with the private sector with this TPG Rise Climate Fund, where I'm an executive chairman, and it's a $7 billion fund. And we have 28 major companies, many of whom never invested as a limited partners in a climate fund before. And so I'm very close to this market. And I see two things going on. I see innovation in the private sector, which is phenomenal, okay? Because companies look and they recognize markets are going to look to the future, right? And this energy transition the world is going to go through is going to be massive. It's going to require a lot of capital. And they realize the markets are going to look to the future. And we saw it with cellular, right? Where the earnings and the cash flows were in yellow pages and landline, but the markets looked ahead and moved to cellular. Well, so given all that, I see companies having great aspirations and working, but I don't see governments giving them the tools they need to help make these technologies commercially viable. Because just investing in something where you're not going to get the money back is not a sustainable strategy. So governments need to do more. Now, you talked about, which I think is very, very positive, about some of the things that are happening in your part of the world, particularly with green hydrogen, right, and solar. But what additional tools do governments need to give the private sector to drive the low carbon energy transition? Governments just can't set targets, right, and say, we've set these targets, okay, now go meet them.
Right. Well, this is a very big question. It has many good answers as well, but let me go into what is working and what's not in this area. And we just spoke about the role of governments and the role of multilateral development banks. I think before getting the benefits, we need to stop the harm. And stopping the harm means stopping any kind of crowding out that the private sector really is suffering from, especially in areas that the private sector has proven to be more active, agile, innovative, providing solutions, as you said. And that could really be through good deal with the MDBs, with the multilateral development banks. When countries borrow to mitigate, they need really to do less borrowing for mitigation and more for adaptation until we see a good business model for the private sector to get engaged in. But now the private sector has identified a role, found its voice, and possibilities of work, and proven actually during the last few years with successful projects in energy and decarbonization and new technologies, including in battery and beyond. But when it comes to adaptation, we need really to do more in order to encourage the private sector, as we're trying to say before. But the problem is now, when I see a typical development bank institution, is providing finance 80% in mitigation and 20% in adaptation. No, for God's sake, make the shift. Do more in adaptation. This is the road less traveled. And then avail whatever partnership that the private sector can really like to have with the MDBs. The MDBs can do de-risking, can bear the first loss, can provide insurance against political risk, but that will not really be as much as they are doing today when it comes to funding. There will be much less, and avail the funding where it's much more needed in the adaptation side. That would be one thing. The second, which I saw it in 15 good examples of MOUs that my home country here in Egypt had done with the private sector and consortium of variety of projects in the green hydrogen, where the government is availing the land because these projects in green hydrogen are really in great need of space with good locations. Second, they provide some good support through public national grid for electricity, green one. And then they provide some sort of facilitations and a bit of standards that they have been engaged in. And I'm happy to see 6 countries from Africa have been engaged to put the standards for green and clean hydrogen. So this is a good role of government, doing the regulatory side, the standards, and availing land, and then giving a fair opportunity for 15 big projects to compete or to complement each other in this work. Then it's always encouraging to see MOUs, but more encouraging to see them translated into agreements, binding agreements with offtake arrangements. And out of the 15, you'll be seeing in Sharm el-Sheikh at least 3 projects announcing the full framework, including the binding agreements in this front. So I'm happy to see this kind of progress. And this is a kind of a nice division of labor between public contribution and private sector ability and agility and getting things done. And in addition, of course, to a better finance mix than what we have. Because so far, when it comes to climate action, globally, more than 60% is debt dependent. When it comes to developing economies, is more than 75 to 80% debt dependent. When you get the private sector, equity participation will be enhanced. And if there is debt, it's going to be the responsibility of the private sector, not the public sector or government in this case.
I tell you, well said. And what I liked best about your answer is you began with resilience and adaptation. And I just hope that what we will see at the upcoming COP is the same emphasis on this that you're placing on it. Because as important as mitigation is, we have to get through the night, right? And there we really do. And there's been far too little attention. And so I just hope that the COP places the same priority on this that you have in our discussion today. Now, as the world transitions, so back to the private sector, as the world transitions to a clean energy economy, what opportunities do you see for businesses here?
The sky is the limit, because we know what we know, but the market dynamics and the innovation and the ability through competition by the private sector, I would say that it's going to be the main engine behind any kind of development going forward. I've been seeing the good innovation, especially by young entrepreneurs. And here the scale is important, because I was yesterday at the American University Greek campus here in Egypt, 34 projects from some of the underprivileged areas in Egypt, providing solutions at their own community level in waste management, in using organic fertilizers, in supporting high productivity, in partnership between NGOs and 6 universities in the south of the country. So this could be really one of the areas that may not really be under the radar of the big media only following what's happening with the big wigs and the big names. But now as well, I see that as could be in a kind of a more developed supply chain, that these kind of small producers with young entrepreneurs being linked with the international standards to solve many of the issues that we are suffering from, getting the local link to the regions and the regions link to the global players. And I see it more in the agricultural sector and farming than in other areas. Now, there is a tendency as well, and you see it from many African voices. They are saying, well, we don't like just to install the best kind of developed project in renewables. We need to be part of the production. We don't need just to see our extractive industry availing the opportunities to have more solar farms or wind farms, but we need to be part of the production with high value. So the role of the private sector is going to be through the big names that we are familiar with internationally, but perhaps giving opportunities to some of the promising local players of the small and medium enterprises.
I very much agree with you. I think the way to think about this climate challenge is there's three parts to it. There's, first of all, we have to provide affordable electricity to power to the several billion people who are going to need it between now and 2050. We have to, deal with adaptation and help the world deal with the change that's going to take place, the climate shocks that are going to take place no matter what we do, based upon the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. And then thirdly, transition to a low carbon economy. And right now it's 80% of our energy is driven by fossil-based fuels. So that's a big challenge, but it's going to be one of perhaps the biggest industrial transition in history. It's going to take decades and trillions of dollars of capital. There will be many, many jobs created. And these jobs of the future, of course, it's not just going to benefit some of the big names and the big companies, but it's a transition that's going to filter down everywhere. So there's going to be all sorts of jobs created. That's the good news. There's also going to be real dislocations. It's going to hit certain industries very hard and certain parts of the world very hard, which makes it so challenging. But I want to now talk about another challenge that doesn't attract the same headlines as the climate crisis, but in my view is even more immediate and every bit as alarming. That's the decline of global biodiversity. When we take a look at the rate at which we're seeing species extinction, right, it is pretty formidable. And so we know climate goes with biodiversity, right? Climate change, the world overheating is speeding up, accelerating the biodiversity loss, and as natural capital is destroyed, that's accelerating climate. But we know much more about climate than we know about everything that's involved when we talk about throwing something, dealing with something as important as Mother Nature, this complex global ecosystem, and the risk to that. So how can we protect nature while rapidly building out clean energy infrastructure? Talk a little bit. Will biodiversity be part of this discussion in Egypt? And even if it won't, tell us a little bit about how you think about it.
Right. Well, I think there is a very strong link between the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh and the summit in Canada a few weeks after on biodiversity. And there are a few sessions during the days, including a dedicated session on biodiversity, on the Science Day, on Solutions Day, on the role of finance for climate and nature, including some financial innovation in areas related to debt reduction mechanisms and linking them to investment in climate and nature. There are some good examples, as we know, from Seychelles, from Belize, and more recently from Barbados, on how to link debt reduction to better investment in climate and better investment in nature. And in terms of the substance of the work, the interlinkages need to be established. And I'm happy that one of the sessions is going to be demonstrating that in Sharm el-Sheikh. And that would be, I think, very much based on an excellent report, scientific report led by Professor Dasgupta, the very well professor in Cambridge, who published that like a couple of months before Glasgow, about the links between climate, nature, and the overall sustainable development goals, and how, and this is the beauty of finance as we know it, because sometimes people focusing vertically and working in silos and don't really work with others in a kind of closed communities and closed clubs. And then they would need finance from people like you and people from the MDBs and others. So here the issue of finance and the finance opportunities and possible spillovers, positive and negative, and the finance constraints, put them to work together. So some of the projects that are going to be introduced from the 5 regions I mentioned are linking climate finance to biodiversity finance, especially in maritime and coastal areas. There's some work as well in the protection of land degradation, had been preventing of land degradation, is working as well in finance and investment in this area with consideration of environment, biodiversity, and climate together. So yes, I think it came from the conceptual interlinkages, which are very well established, to the finance and investment opportunities that are going to be promoted in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Well, I thank you for that answer. I have a high regard for Professor Dasgupta. I did a podcast with him. Our institute, the Paulson Institute, did a groundbreaking study in September of 2020, looking at biodiversity and the risk to biodiversity, and looking at all the global flows and looking at the practical mechanisms for finance. But the interesting part of that study was, and there are many financing mechanisms that can be used, but the interesting part of it is far cheaper to protect biodiversity to begin with than to go about trying to restore it after it's been destroyed, right? And the fascinating thing was, if you were to say, what are the several things that governments could do to deal with this, that the biggest things they could do really wouldn't cost a lot of money. It would cost almost no money, right? And there are things like changing these perverse agriculture subsidies when you're looking at fisheries, forestries, and farming. So you still incentivize production, but do it in a way in which it doesn't destroy biodiversity. And the way we think about infrastructure, it's going to take trillions of dollars of infrastructure, but where we build the infrastructure, how we build the infrastructure, and also having financial institutions disclose the impact of their investments, right? Their investments or their loans on biodiversity. So there's a lot that can be done. I'm glad you're working on the linkages, and all of that is terrific. And so let's end, Mahmoud, with a note of optimism. As we approach COP27 next month, what gives you hope about the future?
Well, it's the young and their involvement in providing solutions. We have been seeing youth around the world concerned about the future and what kind of life they would be facing if we're not taking climate action agenda, which had been great. But what I see more today, in addition to this strong voice coming from the youth, what I'm seeing in many solutions coming from their partnerships as well. So that gets me to be more optimistic than just leaving matters to political leaders and big names in the markets. Yes, their role is essential, but if I rely on the good wisdom of the Secretary General of the UN, that we are suffering from a deficit in trust. So this kind of deficit needs really to be mitigated and dealt with and bridged. And I'm seeing really leaders of communities, from universities, from businesses, trying to bridge gaps of knowledge, of optimism, and actually contributing as well with their efforts and finance to providing the solution. And I'm seeing this kind of partnership pushing us towards what we should be seeing in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Well said, because these bigwigs and clearly governments aren't going to act unless they feel the support of the citizens, right?
Absolutely.
And so unless more citizens around the world are united, and young people in particular, we won't get the action we need. So that's important. So, Dr. Mahmoud, thank you so much. I just appreciate this discussion a lot. You've covered a lot of ground for our listeners, and I thank you for all the work you're doing to help meet the climate challenge. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Keep up the great work.
Great. Secretary Paulson, Dr. Mohieldin, thank you for such an informative discussion across the broad range of topics of climate change, biodiversity, and certainly previewing the upcoming COP. This meeting is so important for Africa, for emerging markets, and we agree that it's important to move to binding agreements, but even more important, it's essential to move to action. We wish you all the best for the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, and many thanks to our audience for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to welcome you in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.